Japan in the 1920s and 30s represents one of the most fascinating and convoluted episodes in political history. For a period of about 2 decades, it was never really clear if any one person or group was in charge of the country. And indeed, for most of the 20s and 30s, the various factions within Japan operated as semi autonomous states. You had the army, which was subdivided. You had the Kuomintang army, and then you had the army in the other parts of China. You had the navy, which didn't talk to the army. You had sub factions within the army, like the Imperial Way and the Control faction. You had the liberal Taisho Democracy movement. You had the various political parties. You had the emperor. You had all these different groups who had mutually exclusive ideas, and there wasn't really any central force to rein them all in. And so the whole thing was just kind of run as this really anarchaic system, if you can say it was even run at all. However, fortunately for the Japanese, the enemies they were up against, at least until America entered the war, were so weak and they were just as, if not more, divided that this system kind of limped along and they actually managed to win a number of victories. And I guess, in a sense, that almost kind of reinforced to the people of the government of Japan that this bizarre system was working. So let's just kind of take a dive into this and let's look at some of the factions and some of the things that happened and why, in my view, it was kind of such a mess. Now, this video is based on the book Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, plus my own research. And for the remainder of this video, I'm going to refer to Hirohito as the Showa Emperor or just Showa, out of respect, because I do have a lot of respect for the Japanese imperial family, and that's what his regnal name is after his death. So I'm going to go with that. I'm also probably going to get a couple details wrong. I'm not going to focus too much on kind of the minutia. The idea is just to kind of give you an idea of how insane things were during this time period. So maybe let's start off by talking a bit about the, I guess you could say, ideological background. Now, the emperor had always been a religious figure within Japan. Some people have said his role is more akin to a pope than to an actual temporal leader. There were time periods in Japan where the emperor was extremely poor and kind of had to depend upon the charity of his subjects. And whatever power the emperor did have was normally exercised by regents, either by a previous emperor who had retired or a member of the Fujiwara family. There was a time period which I've tried to understand, but it's just kind of emblematic of how complex Japanese politics are. Where, okay, so the emperor were controlled by the Fujiwara, who were the power behind the throne, and then the Fujiwara would be controlled by the Hojo, or the old Hojo, or whoever. So it was like the power behind the throne was being controlled by the power behind the throne. And that's just kind of like the archetypical Japanese governmental system. So, anyways, the emperor was always important, but when the Meiji Restoration happened, the emperor was kind of seen as something that could knit Japan together, that he could be the embodiment of the state, that they could end feudalism, they could end the division, and they would be one unified Japanese people underneath the emperor. And the concept is very loose, but there's a political concept in Japan called the kokutai, which the book tries to define, and I've reread the section several times, but it's kind of confusing. I think it's kind of organic nationalism is the best thing I can get, that the Japanese are one people, indivisible. They've always been the Japanese, and within the system, they've always had an emperor, and the emperor's always been the father figure, and the Japanese people exist as a spiritual, moral, and biological nation who are unified by the emperor. And it has, I guess, kind of aspects of integralism with like everybody is integrated into the Japanese state and everybody has a role. So this was adopted, and later on during, I think it was the 1920s when they passed the national security law, it became illegal to try to undermine the kokutai or to undermine the Japanese nation. So this was kind of adopted as the official ideology. The emperor was promoted to being the embodiment of the Japanese state and the source where everything stems from. That being said, though, the role of the emperor was never really defined. Um, it really varied. Emperor Meiji was very powerful. The Taisho emperor was incapable for the vast majority of his regime, as he had gotten lead poisoning as a kid. So during that era, the emperor lost most of his power, and then Emperor Showa tried to restore some of that power. And even during this time period, there was a number of different theories. Like there was a theory that the emperor was an absolute monarch whose person was sacrosanct, who had no personal responsibility, and he could basically do anything he wanted. There was another theory that the emperor's role was to guide from behind the scenes. There were also constitutional monarchists. And one of the things we'll kind of get into a bit is these positions did not really line up along the lines you might expect them to. So you would have like far right ultranationalists who wanted a constitutional monarchy, and you'd have liberals who wanted an absolute monarchy. And these weren't kind of unusual mixtures to have. So the emperor was kind of viewed as the embodiment of the state. And kind of over this time period, you had state Shinto form. So Shinto, I don't think you can ever really say was a religion per se. It was kind of a collection of Japanese spiritual practices that had syncretized very easily, or over time had just syncretized with Buddhism, and so you had this kind of Buddhist Shinto thing. It's a bit like what happened with Hinduism, where the British kind of invented this term to describe a variety of related Indian religions and religious practices. Shinto was just kind of defined as being this authentically Japanese religion. And the interesting thing about state Shinto is it actually very much secularized religion in Japan. From my understanding, they actively suppressed, I think it was called sect Shinto, but it was like the actual religious or spiritual types of Shinto were repressed. Buddhism was largely repressed as well. And it was just kind of made into solely a tool of the state, which purpose was to worship the emperor as the divine representation of the Japanese state and people. And once again, if you're a Westerner looking at Eastern religion, it's confusing because it's something called orthopraxy instead of orthodoxy. Belief doesn't really matter in most Eastern religions, except with the notable exception, of course, of Pure Land Buddhism. But participation in Shinto was conducting sacrifices or rituals. So eventually it would come to the point where everybody had to regularly participate in Shinto rituals. And contrary to what people might think, this was extended to the colonies. So, like people in Taiwan and Korea were forced to conduct Shinto rituals. And like it's weird because the Meiji Constitution had made Christianity legal and instituted freedom of religion for like the first time in Japanese history, but Christians, etc., still had to go make sacrifices. And this wasn't really viewed as being, I guess you could say, an imposition, because the the sacrifices were just kind of a thing. And the author speculates that the Showa emperor himself probably didn't believe in his own divinity and that he was descended from a god. If for no other reason than the fact he was very well educated in biology and evolution and stuff like that. But it was something he kind of came to embrace as being like the noble myth. During the time period, there wasn't really a difference in Japan between myth, propaganda, and actual history. So, like in the book, they talk about how the historical role of the emperor was completely like redacted, and there's this idea that the emperor was always in power in Japan. He was always the guiding force of the nation. He was always the direct ruler of the country. But then there is also like the counter narrative that the emperor wasn't in control of the country, and that's why you needed the Meiji Restoration. And it's like the Japanese don't really have a problem believing both of these at the same time, and we'll kind of see this as it goes along. So they didn't have like a problem saying, okay, state Shinto is the state religion, but we're also modern and we have freedom of religion. Um, the emperor's power was constantly being usurped by the shoguns, but the emperor was always in power. It's just you have to understand these things don't seem to matter. You also had a lot of social Darwinism was very readily embraced by the Japanese, as well as I guess you could call it scientific racism, was very widely embraced. As was the idea that Japan. It depends upon it because some people thought Japan had a destiny to conquer the world, so that all would be brought under the benevolence of the emperor, which was what some of the imperial way thought. Others believed, like, because today we kind of see the Pan Asian co prosperity sphere as being a meme, but a lot of people actually believed it. It's really funny because one of the sources he quotes says, "We hear Americans talk about the yellow peril, but we in the East must be concerned about the white peril." And they talked about the need for Japan to unite the Asiatic race, to like unite all the Chinese and Koreans and Manchu and the other peoples of East Asia under one banner, and they would become like a state under the emperor, which would be the well, they call themselves the yellow race or the Asiatic race. And there was constant rhetoric in Japan about how racial discrimination was bad. At the Versailles Peace Conference and the foundation of the League of Nations, the Japanese took part in both, and they tried to get a anti-racial discrimination clause in. And they constantly complained about how racist Americans were, and they didn't want Japanese immigrants, and how Japan was like a tolerant society. And at the same time, these same people would say the Chinese and Koreans are subhuman, they have to be exterminated or interbred with Japanese until they become ethnic Japanese. And there was no internal contradiction as far as I can determine. So people would say the Japanese are the least racist people on earth. We want a unity of all the world's races with no discrimination. But they'd also be signing warrants to try to exterminate the Koreans or whatever. And that's just kind of par for the course. And once again, this was not like confined to ultranationalism. You'd have liberals who'd have this opinion, and then you'd have ultranationalists who were legitimately not racist. It's really, really strange. And then maybe kind of the weirdest thing on top of all of this was Taisho Democracy, where due in part to the weakness of the Taisho Emperor, as he was kind of incapable for the entirety of the 1920s, you had political parties and civilian politicians trying to assert their role. So you had the Seiyukai and the Kensaki, Saikai, if I'm pronouncing it properly, who are kind of like the two major political parties of this era. And sub parties would constantly split off and reform, etc. Basically, they represented the interests of the Japanese nobility and the upper class. The book describes the Seiyukai as being more invested within the Zaibatsu or the big mega corporations, whereas the Kensakai was Seikai was more interested in the rural landowners. But both were kind of this weird, like center right 19th, 18th century liberal conservative party. And you had this movement to try to limit the power of the military and kind of modernize Japan and make it more like the West. At the same time, you have the military kind of running around. And into this, you also had the Showa Emperor who is trying to reassert his royal prerogatives, and he doesn't really seem to have decided who exactly he wanted to back. And like at times he'd back the military or the ultranationalists, and at times he'd back the civilian government. And it was really just kind of all over the place. So you have all these different factions, like I said, with mutually exclusive aims. Probably the core conflict, though, was between the civilian and military wings of Japan. The Japanese military, particularly by this point in time, was extremely large and powerful. It consumed an immense amount of the country's budget to the point that it severely impacted the amount of money the government had for economic development. Actually, there was numerous times during the 20s and I believe the 30s where the civilian government attempted to rein in spending. Because the idea being, okay, we have to grow our economy, we have to focus on industrializing, and then we can afford to build all this stuff later. Um, there's not a point in spending 20%. I'm just using these numbers of nowhere of our GDP now to build less than what we could build in 10 years with 5% of our GDP, which makes sense, but the military didn't understand that. The belief was that if Japan could be completely mobilized for total war, if they could have a constant war economy where all national production was focused towards building stuff for war, then they could just eventually squeeze enough of the economy into making weapons that they could overcome the comparatively smaller, less advanced size of their economy, which ultimately didn't really work. But wishful thinking was a big part of the Japanese war effort and kind of how their politics functioned during this period. The idea being, and this might come from Buddhism and just kind of the solipsism of Eastern religions, that if they willed it hard enough, if they were willing to spiritually commit themselves enough, things would just kind of happen. So, as I'm sure you're aware, during this time period, China was in a state of chaos. The country was nominally led by the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai shek, but they really didn't control that much of the country. You still had Mao, of course, you had various warlords. Manchuria was really not, in any meaningful sense, controlled by the central government. So the enterprising Japanese military officers felt this was a good time to invade China, and this made a certain amount of sense. It's the logic that Germany was kind of following in both world wars, that Russia was so much larger in terms of land, manpower, and resources, that if it could ever develop properly and get its war machine going, Germany would have absolutely no chance of stopping it. So, aside from just a desire, this belief in Japan ruling the world, aside from just kind of overpopulation in Japan and the need for more resources on the mainland, I think there is a practical aspect here where this is going to be our only chance to land a knockout blow against China. And God knows what's going to happen if they become fully industrialized, if the nationalists can get their act together and they can properly unify the country. So during the 1920s and 30s, you had a variety of false flags undertaken. You had the Mukden incident, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the January 28th incident. I think there was a couple others. I think there was a case, I can't find the exact, what its name was exactly, where like some Japanese officers assassinated some other officers and tried to frame the Chinese for it. And like in Shanghai, the Japanese would practice firing drills like right next to a nationalist barracks and maybe accidentally hit it a couple times. And the nationalist troops thought they were under attack, so they would fire back. Like something the Japanese would do a lot during this time period is they would invade Chinese territory and occupy it. And if the local garrison resisted, they would say it was an act of war and an act of aggression on the part of the Chinese. The Kuomintang army basically also just invaded Manchuria without any orders from the Japanese government. In fact, the civilian government several times tried to rein in the army, but were completely ineffective. The book states that in a lot of cases it's because the emperor decided to support the army and lobby against any of the soldiers being punished. You also had a number of cases during this time period where more than one Japanese prime minister was assassinated by the army when they attempted to rein them in. Like they wanted to court martial the officers who were carrying out assassination attempts, or sorry, were assassinating other Japanese officers, or punishing people for invading countries without any central orders. And they would either get forced out of office or they would get assassinated or there'd be assassination attempts. And the emperor and kind of the establishment would more or less refuse to punish them. Or if they'd punish them, it would be very light. And the military, I mean, if we're going to talk about economics, there's incentives, and people respond to incentives. So if the emperor is giving the idea that, oh, no one's going to actually be punished for this, it's they were maybe they were good boys, they didn't do nothing. We need to invade some more countries and grab more colonial territory for Japan. The army was like, okay, we can just do whatever the hell we want. And this eventually accumulated in the February 26th incident, where the Imperial Wei faction attempted to take over the government, but was put down by the emperor and his personal guard and the Imperial Japanese Army. So you had all these different groups. Civilian government eventually just kind of became completely defanged and powerless because prime ministers kept getting assassinated, and the emperor gradually favored the military more and more. But let's kind of get into where things really started to come off the rails. Other than the fact that the Japanese economy was kind of a disaster at this point in time because all the resources were going into military expenditures that they couldn't really afford. The different factions within the military and navy had totally different plans. So the Imperial Way faction thought that the main enemy of Japan, or the main ideological rival, was the Soviet Union, and they wanted to strike north. They wanted to invade Siberia and maybe possibly in alliance with Germany overthrow the communist regime there. Then you had the Kuomintang army who wanted to invade northeastern China, further expand Manchuria, and maybe set up a broader puppet state. Then you had other factions in the army who wanted to invade Shanghai and southern China. Then you had the navy, which wanted to strike south and secure the resources area. And you just had a variety of different groups who had their own pet projects. Obviously, Japan barely had the resources to do any one of these things, let alone to do all of these things simultaneously. And as bad as this was on paper, there wasn't really war objectives. Like when they invaded China proper, the objective was stated to be to make China self reflect upon its behavior. Now, you might be wondering, what the hell does that even mean? And they didn't really know. Like, does that mean to just surrender and China becomes a colony? Does it mean accepting certain demands? There doesn't appear to have been any demands, at least at the outset. They just kind of invaded China and Shanghai to Nanjing and that kind of area, and just started like blowing stuff up and taking territory. But there didn't really appear to be any kind of clear objective or war goal, and that's always a really bad sign. The Japanese were never really able to set up a meaningful puppet government or rival regime in China because their puppets tended to be held on a very, very short leash, far more than the um, Germans controlled their satellite states. The satellite states in Europe had a lot more autonomy, and they weren't kind of controlled in as direct a way. But like, there's a variety of different things they could have done. They could have just tried to force the nationalist government to cede the major port cities and kind of the more valuable parts of the country. They could have focused on colonizing Manchuria. They could have focused on war reparations or trying to set up a rival government and have it become the legitimate government of China. But there doesn't really seem to have been any war aim. And even when we get into 1944 with Operation Ichigo, the idea still seemed to be if they could just kill enough nationalist army soldiers, then the government would collapse somehow and Japan would win. What did victory look like in China? I have no idea. I don't think they really had any idea. Same thing with like what they were going to do in Southeast Asia. Were they going to annex it? Were they going to set up satellite states? Were they going to settle them with Japanese? We don't really know because there was all these competing ideas. And once again, we see this like when World War II started and Japan literally tried to invade everywhere at once. It's like, okay, we're going to invade the Pacific. We're going to keep going in China, although China petered out a bit. We're going to go as far west as Burma. That's totally going to work out. That's a brilliant idea. We're going to, like, they just attacked everywhere at once. And the whole thing just became a logistical mess because they had to, like, I think it was literally hundreds of islands that they had garrisons on that they had to supply by the sea. And Japan, it made their oil situation way worse. Like, I think a good example of Japanese wishful thinking is with Operation Ichigo, which was in 1944, where the Japanese just did one massive offensive to try to beat the nationalists and end the war. And their 40 chess plan was they were going to open a corridor from Manchuria to Southeast Asia so they could keep importing resources from uh, Indonesia and Malaysia up to Manchuria and then to Japan. How they thought that that was going to ever work, I don't know. So it's a massive like salient you're going to have to defend, and I don't think it really did work out at all. But it's difficult to win a war just through attrition if there's no political goals or there's really no political solution. Like in World War One, the German strategy, at least from what I understand, is to inflict enough casualties on the Russians and French so that they would have to capitulate. And in truth, the French, from my understanding, were very close to capitulating because they had suffered such horrific casualties and their armies had started to mutiny. And it is possible if they had to push them a bit more, if they would have sued for peace. Not necessarily the government would have been overthrown, but it would have just been politically and economically impossible to continue. In the case of Russia, the Tsarist regime was already unstable and there was already widespread dissatisfaction. And the complete trouncing of the Russian armies completely destabilized the Tsar's position and got him overthrown. So Germany wound up achieving all of their war aims and then some, probably with Brest-Litovsk more than they ever could have dreamed of. But there wasn't really a way to achieve victory in China, because partially just because China is so big. So every time they try to take the nationalist capital, they just move further inland. And if they weren't willing to surrender and the communists weren't willing to surrender, they were just left with having to pull more and more troops into China to occupy more and more land without really having much to show for it. So that's kind of a summary or an overview of what happened in Japan politically during the 1920s and 30s. Now, I know I probably got a lot of historical facts wrong, but it's difficult. Like, as I said, I've been through this stuff a couple times, and it's just very incoherent because there aren't clear ideological factions. Like within the context of Western Europe, you would generally speaking, not always, but often in fascist movements, you'd have like the monarchists, the traditional Christians, the nationalists, the populists, and they'd manage to find some kind of common ground. Like in Spain, I think it was called the Commune Traditionalist or the Traditionalist Commune or whatever it was, Franco's party. Or it might have just been called the Phalange, but it was a union of the various right wing factions, ranging from the Phalangists to the kind of more moderate conservatives. You had economic liberals, you had socialists, but they were all kind of united in their hatred of communism and liberalism. In Italy, the fascists eventually had to reconcile with the Pope and become a more Christian movement. And that was just kind of generally speaking the case as you get the various right wing groups kind of talking and come together. That didn't happen in Japan. And once again, it was quite possible to be an imperialist, but also reject the emperor's divinity, or to be a liberal, but want an absolute monarchy. Like it's very convoluted. But it's a fascinating time period. I'd probably recommend the book, Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan. It's written by a Western liberal, which is actually a pretty good perspective because he's very critical of Japan, but he's not critical of Japan from a raw America. We beat those assholes in World War II kind of perspective. It's very much it's very critical, but it's not critical in kind of a burger way, if that makes sense. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry if that was super long and confusing, but it's a long and confusing topic.